Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, it is difficult to put into words what it is like to stand here on the floor of the United States Senate on this day of all days. For 163 years, this space has been the home of the upper chamber of the American Congress. What has taken place inside this room over the centuries has determined in very real ways the trajectory of our nation. In this room, we carry on the mission handed down to us by the framers to assure the voice of the people is heard and represented and acted upon. But 1 year ago today, on January 6, 2021, mob violence descended upon this chamber and upon this Capitol. Thousands of rioters, possessed by equal measures of rage, conspiracy, and spurred into action by the sitting President of the United States, attacked the United States Capitol in an armed, violent, and deadly effort to halt the peaceful transfer of power. Its windows were smashed, its offices were vandalized, and lawmakers and our staffs, everyday citizens who love their country and work here every day, feared for their lives. Nearly 140 police officers were injured, and at least 5 people lost their lives that day or in its aftermath. The warnings of history are clear. When democracies are in danger, it often starts with a mob. That's what happened a year ago here in this building, a mob attack. And for mob violence to win the day, it doesn't need everyone to join in. It just needs a critical mass of people to stay out of the way, to ignore it, to underestimate it, to excuse it, and even condone it. The mob can start out as a small number, but if it's allowed to grow and leaders egg on the mob, encourage it, it can become poison. That is what Donald Trump is doing, as even his response to President Biden's speech today showed. And once that happens, the unthinkable could become real. Democracy erodes and could, God forbid, horror of horrors, vanish. Poisonous mob mentality lives on today in the threats against election workers, poll workers, even other public servants like school board members and health workers. This is what erodes a democracy. And Donald Trump today continues to spread his poisonous vial about the big lie. To borrow from President Franklin Roosevelt, the violent insurrection of January 6 was a day that will live forever in infamy, a permanent stain in the story of the American democracy, and the final, bitter, unforgivable act of the worst president in modern times. Today, on this first anniversary, members from both the House and Senate and our staffs, the President and the Vice President, are here today at the Capitol, and one of our purposes is to share memories in commemoration of that day. At noon, we will hold a moment of silence in honor of those who were lost because of the attack. And to all my colleagues and to staff who struggle to get through today, you're not alone. You are not alone. We are here by your side. The Employee Assistance Program has resources available to all Senate staff who are processing what happened a year ago. Let me share my personal experience on that day. As I've recounted many times since then, my personal experience that day was in some ways like the opening sentence of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, the best of times, the worst of times. First came the best of times. 12 hours before the attack, at 4 a.m. in the morning, I learned, several hours before the attack, at 4 a.m., I learned that our 2 Democratic senators had won in Georgia, and we would gain the majority. At 4 a.m. it became clear. I tried to get some sleep, couldn't. Got down in my car, drove to Washington, and got to the floor of this chamber at 1 p.m. for the first time as the putative majority leader. Within 45 minutes of sitting there and watching the beginning of counting the ballots, a police officer in a big flak jacket and a large rifle grabbed me firmly by the collar, like this. I'll never forget that grip. And said to me, "Senator, we got to get out of here. You're in danger." We walked out the Senate chamber door, made a right turn, went through another door. This happened to be captured on the video tape above, and it was shown at the impeachment trial, although I didn't even know they had the tape until I saw it at the impeachment trial. But we go through the door, you don't see us for 20 seconds, and then we are running out of the door at full speed. I was within 30 feet of these nasty, racist, bigoted insurrectionists. Had someone had a gun, had two of them blocked off the door, who knows what would have happened. I was told later that one of them reportedly said, "There's the big Jew, let's get him." Bigotry against one is bigotry against all. And I saw something that I've been told later never happened before, the Confederate flag flying in this dear capital. That's just one of many searing, grotesque images of that unimaginable, most un-American day. There were good moments, too. I remember when the leaders, Senator McConnell, myself, Speaker Pelosi, Leader McCarthy, were sent off to the secret place. We convened after desperately trying to get the president on the phone to ask him to call the rioters off. We spoke to the Secretary of Defense and the acting Attorney General, but to no avail. But then the four of us got together and said, we're going to come back. We're going to count those votes. We're not going to let the violent insurrectionists stop us. And count the votes we did until I believe it was 3 a.m. the next morning. That was a good moment amidst a lot of bad moments. So now we ask, 1 year later, how shall our country move forward? What are we to say and think and do in response to a day when a sitting American president, rather than step down from office, unleashed his own supporters to attack the government through mob violence? How can we help those scarred by that day find solace, find healing? How can we make clear to the American people, to the world, and even to ourselves, that our democracy is still whole? First, we must begin by commemorating our emergency responders who have died, whether through complications from injuries or sadly through suicide, in the days and months after the violence. Brian Sicknick of New Jersey, Howie Liebengood of Virginia, Billy Evans of Massachusetts, Jeffrey Smith of Illinois, and Gunther Hashida of Virginia. Today and every day, we remember them. We mourn their loss. We honor their limitless heroism in the face of the unthinkable. Second, we also thank every single member of the Capitol Police, the DC Metro Police, and the National Guard, who kept us safe and prevented a violent riot from turning into something much worse. That afternoon, our Capitol Police were outnumbered, unprepared, and largely left on their own. Just watching on television the brutal beating of one of them by the mob, another being crushed between a door and a wall, just rips your heart apart, and you relive that day, and you remember how the Capitol Police suffered but persisted and helped preserve our democracy. When they held the line, our democracy survived, and so not only do we thank them, but we commit to continue supporting them and fighting for them as they fought to defend this building. Finally, The only way we'll truly move forward from January 6th is by speaking truth to power. We cannot avoid it. The truth about what happened that day, about what led to the violence, about what it means for our democracy moving forward. I say this because too many, often depending on their allegiances, seem desperate to sweep the memory of January 6th under the rug. Too many are working to rewrite the history of what happened, to downplay or excuse or even defend the mob, to excuse an insurrection of this very Capitol. Too many are hoping the American people will just look away and forget that that day ever took place. After all, they say, Donald Trump is no longer president, right? That can't happen. We can't let that happen. We have an obligation not to let that happen. Because history shows us when you ignore or paint over this kind of violent action, it will recur, often in worse form than it had originally. That's what history shows. We didn't look away after the attack on Pearl Harbor. We didn't look away after the attacks on 9/11. They may have been from foreign powers, but we still, just because it was Americans who did this, we cannot look away after the attack of January 6th. What we must do instead is stare the truth, however ugly, in the face. The attack of January 6th didn't come out of the blue. It was not an act of God. It was not something that came from foreign soil. It wasn't even just some mere protest that got out of hand. No, 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 no. January 6th was an attempt to reverse, through violent means, the outcome of a free and fair election. An insurrection. Call it what it is, what it was. And it was fundamentally rooted in Donald Trump's big lie that the election of 2020 was illegitimate, in deep offense to the peaceful transfer of power. Indeed, in deep offense to the very notion of truth itself. And anyone who thinks that the origins of this insurrection are going away should just have listened a few moments ago when Donald Trump did it again, lying and lying and lying about the election. A clear reminder that the threat he and his lie remain to our nation. Alarmingly, many of his supporters quickly embraced the lie in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Many of them truly believed and still believe that he won the election and the game was rigged. Not a small number, large numbers of Americans. If you look at the polls, tens of millions. It didn't matter there was no proof to any of these claims. Donald Trump kept saying it and saying it and saying it again. And he called his supporters to rally here in Washington in a ditch effort to stay in power. We all know this. That's what happened. We can't forget it. It was Donald Trump's big lie that soaked our political landscape in kerosene. It was Donald Trump's rally on the Mall that struck the match. And then came the fire. And pouring gasoline on that fire are many, in one branch of our media, who spread the big lie then and continue to spread the big lie, even though they know it's false. And millions listen to these people and believe it. Here, too, is another terrible truth. The disease of the big lie continues to this day. The attacks on our democracy are ongoing. If not by the force of baseball bats and pipe bombs, then certainly through a quieter and much more organized effort to subvert democracy from the bottom up. Just as the big lie inspired the attack of January 6th, the big lie continues like a disease across state legislatures throughout the country, where we're seeing the most restrictive voter suppression efforts since Jim Crow in 21st century America, turning the clock way back. Let's be abundantly clear. These new anti-voter laws are on the books today only because their authors cited the big lie, cited the fictitious bugaboo of voter fraud, and are trying to succeed where the insurrection failed. Unless we confront the big lie, unless we all do our part to fortify and strengthen our democracy, the political violence of January 6th risks becoming not an aberration, but, God forbid, the norm. And we've seen it too in the threats against election workers, teachers, school administrators, healthcare workers. We cannot put our heads in the sand. We cannot brush this over. And what does that mean for the Senate? I think we have to talk about the realities here today, too. It means we must pass legislation, effective legislation, to defend our democracy, to protect the right to vote. We must pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act so that our country's destiny is determined by the voice of the people and not by the violent whims of lies and even mob rule. We must also guard against the false hopes of solutions that don't deal with the problem, that try to cover it up or push it away because people don't want to deal with it. Some say the answer lies in doing the bare minimum, like reforming the Electoral Count Act that my friend, the Republican leader, has floated in recent days. Let me take this opportunity to make clear that that plan, the McConnell plan, that's what it is unacceptable, unacceptably insufficient, and even offensive. Some scorekeeping matters little if the game is rigged. And as we know too well, state legislatures are working day and night to undermine our democratic process from the get-go by empowering partisans to potentially say which ballots count and which do not. What good is it to accurately count a result that's compromised from the start? Senator McConnell's plan to reform the Electoral Count Act would do nothing more than codify the Vice President's ceremonial role in counting of the Electoral College votes, effectively guaranteeing that partisan state legislatures could overturn the elections without fear of recourse. Look at what it does. Look at what it does. It's a cynical idea. It's an idea to divert attention from the real issue because they don't want to confront the real issue. This cannot be, this should not be about one party versus another. Voting rights has always been bipartisan, supported by Bush, HW&W, supported by Reagan, passing this chamber with large votes from both sides of the aisle. That's what always used to happen until the Republican Party was taken over by Donald Trump. So, it's not about one party versus another. It can't be. It's about
one that is very important, and the chief has committed to fill those vacancies. But what have we done? The progress? Well, we have, one, gotten the new personnel in. Two, we have passed a law in this chamber and signed into law by President Biden that makes it easier for the chief to call in the National Guard in a case of emergency. We have made sure that there's operational plans in place, as there were this summer when major events occur. And one of the saddest memories of that day was the fact that 75% of the police officers asked to defend this Capitol were in plain clothes. 75%. In many cases, they had less protective gear on than the invaders of the Capitol. That has changed. No more equipment that's going to be locked on a bus that they can't access. Senator Leahy's leadership with appropriations, Senator Shelby's leadership, we've been able to obtain more funding to get them the equipment that they need. All of those things are important. But as Senator Schumer noted, the other piece of this is our democracy itself. And that means getting to the bottom of what happened. Something is happening right now with the House Select Committee that is working to get the facts, and we would have loved to have an independent commission like the 9/11 Commission to do that, but they are doing that work over in the House. Yesterday, we heard from Attorney General Garland, who pledged to look at this at every level and to go where the facts will lead. Those were his words. Accountability at every level for what happened here is key, and it is the largest investigation we've seen in the history of America. Over 700 people that have been charged. That is a big piece of this work as well, accountability. And as Senator Schumer noted, this is also about carrying on the torch of our democracy. The voting rights legislation that we are working on right now couldn't be more important, because what was not accomplished with bear spray and bayonets has now been passed on to others to pass bills, as we've seen in Wisconsin, where a bill actually passed that would have allowed for only one ballot drop-off box in the entire city of Milwaukee. That one was vetoed by Governor Evers. But others have passed in states like Georgia, in states like Texas, and across this country, a concerted effort to undermine our democracy. So it is on us, when we take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, no matter what party we're in, to hold our democracy dear. It is a precious, precious thing, and it is very fragile, and it is in our hands to protect, just as our police officers protected it on January 6th. When you've got 9,600 threats against members of Congress, double what it has ever been in the past, that's not a small thing. That is January 6th continued. When you have election officials that have to leave their posts because, in the words of the election official from the city of Philadelphia, that his own family was threatened, their names, their addresses, their house put out on the internet. Katie Hobbs, Secretary of State in Arizona, receiving a voicemail saying, "I'm a hunter, and I think you should be hunted." People in rural areas that are elected officials that cannot have the kind of security that people may have in this building. That's January 6th continued, and we cannot forget our duty going forward. I will end with that image that I will always cherish, and the hope that democracy will prevail at 3:30 in the morning when Senator Blunt and I and Vice President Pence took that long walk over to the House with the two young women with the mahogany box filled with the last of the electoral ballots up through Wyoming. There was broken glass on all sides. There was spray paint on statues. It was the same walk we had taken in the morning, which had been so joyful, the celebration of our democracy, so ceremonial. And there we were, the last ones left, taking that walk into the House chambers where we finished our job. So when I look back at that day, that is the lasting image, that in the end, democracy prevailed, that in 2 weeks later, there we were under that beautiful blue sky with leaders of both parties on that inaugural stage saying that, yes, our democracy stood tall It brushed itself off, and we move forward as one nation under God with liberty and justice for all, as we always do. And that is a spirit with which we must go forward in the coming weeks as we debate the importance of keeping that democracy strong with election laws, that we continue to improve the security in this Capitol, and that we hold the people that did this, not just to us, not just to this building, but to our very republic, accountable for what they did. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. These are among the most somber and sorrowful remarks that I've had to make as President pro tempore and also in my several decades of service in this body. What an unthinkable event we're marking today. An attempted coup incited not against a president, but by a president who promoted and still promotes a litany of lies to overturn the results of an election in order for him to hold on to power that he no longer possesses. We are in the business of words, but there are none to adequately capture the damage that he and his henchmen have done and are doing to our country. I am certain that no one serving here ever thought such an attack on our democracy by a violent insurrectionist mob that stormed the Capitol, the very citadel of our democracy, could ever happen in our beloved country, the world's most enduring democracy. This very chamber where we're gathered today was breached, it was desecrated, as was the rest of the Capitol. This morning, in my capacity as President pro tem, I called the Senate into session. As I looked around the chamber, so many memories came to mind. I first saw this Senate chamber as a teenager, visiting from our home in Montpelier, Vermont, with my parents and my sister, coming to this Capitol. And then later, as a Georgetown law student, I would sit in the visitors' gallery and just watch. I saw the members of the Senate in both parties speaking to the conscience of our nation, and trying to protect our Constitution. In 1975, I came onto the floor of the Senate as the junior-most member of this body. I was in awe of the Senate then. I never expected to become the dean of the Senate. But a year ago, I sat on the floor of the Senate as Vice President Pence was announcing the certification of ballots. I saw him doing this in a straightforward and honest way, even though he knew that at the end of the count, he would soon no longer be Vice President, nor would Donald Trump be president. We were all in the Senate paying attention when suddenly officers came rushing onto the floor, and they took the Vice President off the dais and out the door. Chuck Grassley, the then President pro tem, went to the dais and prepared to recess the Senate. Most of us, I remember looking around here, we were wondering what was happening until I saw a few feet from me. I saw a man wearing a vest that said police. On the Senate floor, he was carrying a submachine gun. I'd never seen anything like this in the U.S. Senate. And you recall, Mr. President, the police rushed us through a back door to the basement of the Capitol, and they shuttled us off to a secure location. I was still trying to sort through my mind what was happening. Officers were going through the halls, and one officer came along, took my arm, and he said, he said, we're going to watch out for you, Shamrock. So many memories flooded back because Shamrock was the police code name for me when I was a recipient of a deadly anthrax letter addressed to me that killed and maimed others. Ahead of me, I could see the brave parliamentarians and others who had grabbed the cases with the certification of ballots. They also grabbed the ivory gavel that is right in front of you now, Mr. President, the same gavel I used today to call the Senate into session. And when we were in the secure room, we're starting to see the television, we saw a mob, Americans who turned into a mob and turned their back on our nation's constitutional history. They were rejecting everything that made America great. They're ignoring our laws, our customs, and most of all, they're ignoring our history. The destruction, the rampage was something you would see in a movie. I never expected to see it in the Capitol, a building that's always been a symbol of our democracy. And a suggestion was made when we were in the secure room that we use our authority under the law to vote and make the secure room the Senate chamber. I said, no, we should not be hiding here. Instead of when it's safe to go back to the Senate, whenever it is, we should go back there, all of us, and have the American people see us there. I said it may take an hour, it may take 10 hours, but we should be there carrying out the Constitution and saying no criminals can destroy our history, our Constitution, our America. And I was relieved when virtually all of the Republicans and Democrats who were in that room stood and said loudly they agreed with me. They would wait until we went back. I was standing next to the parliamentarian and the leather boxes carrying the certification of election. We both looked at them. And I'm sure we were both thinking the same thing. We will protect our Constitution. We will protect the Senate. We will protect America. And to the credit of the members of the Senate and the House, we reconvened after the siege. We fulfilled our Constitution.
largest criminal prosecution in the history of this nation. According to the Attorney General, 725 individuals have been charged with a federal crime. 145 pled guilty already to federal misdemeanors. Over 325 have been charged with felonies, many for assaulting, corruptly obstructing or attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. 20 defendants charged with felonies have already pled guilty, and the investigation continues. They talked about the assistance they've received, over 300,000 tips from ordinary citizens to help our government bring to justice those responsible for January 6th. I say that because I listen in disbelief to the polling data which suggests that it really wasn't an attack on the Capitol. It was only a visit of tourists who were in an orderly fashion visiting this building. The videos don't lie. The facts are the facts. Individuals are paying a criminal price and their lives will be changed because of their bad decisions to leave a Trump rally and follow his instructions to come up to this building. That is the reality of what happened that day. But the grimmest reality was the death of 5 of our law enforcement officials who have been named and should be named every time we stand on this floor. Officer Brian Sicknick, Officer Howard Liebengood, Officer Jeffrey Smith, Officer Gunther Hashida, and Officer Kyle DeFreitag, and 140 other law enforcement officials who were assaulted, many of them seriously and still paying a price for that day in their lives when they stood in defense of us, in defense of this building. That is the reality. And if nothing more comes of this speech and commemoration today, I hope that all of us, regardless of our political persuasion, the most conservative Republican to the most progressive Democrat, independents in between, black, white, and brown, men and women, rural, urban, across America, will finally come to an agreement on one thing. Violence has no place in a democracy. Those who resort to violence, wherever they fit on the political spectrum, do not fit on that spectrum, do not belong in this country. And what we saw a year ago today was violence unbridled, violence provoked by a former president of the United States. And many innocent people paid a price. I listened as the President and Vice President spoke this morning in Statuary Hall. It was a somber and meaningful occasion as they talked about what was at stake on January 6th and the challenge we face today. And I thought for a moment what a difference it would have made if, in fact, as the President spoke, Republican and Democratic leaders stood by his side. But that was not to be the case. You see, when the proposal was made for a bipartisan commission of Democrats and Republicans, commissions we've seen in the past for 9/11 and other events that marked our history, that was stopped by Senator McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, by the threat of a filibuster. He wouldn't agree to a bipartisan commission to look into the origins of January 6th and what we need to do to avoid them in the future. So I want to salute Speaker Pelosi for organizing a bipartisan committee in the United States House of Representatives who is investigating this matter. I want to salute my fellow congressman from Illinois, Adam Kinzinger, who's had the courage to step forward and be part of it, as well as Congresswoman Cheney of Wyoming, and the Democrats are part of that effort. They are serving this nation as they should, bringing forth the facts, fighting the resistance from those who don't want to tell the truth. But there's more that we must do. It's been mentioned several times and bears repeating. What is happening across America since January 6th is equally alarming to this assault on the Capitol. And that is the effort by dozens of states across the nation to restrict America's right to vote. To think of it, in that last election in 2020, we had the largest turnout in the history of the United States to cast votes in the presidential election. And the response by so many of these states controlled by Republican legislatures is to try to do their best to make sure that never happens again, to restrict the opportunity to vote for eligible Americans when we should be doing just the opposite. I've won elections and I've lost elections. And as long as they were fair elections, I accepted the results, and they all were. I was lucky. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost. But I felt at the end of the day that there were fair elections. We should feel the same way about the election that occurred just last year, year before last, in 2020, with the election of Joe Biden as President of the United States. It was a fair election. It has been certified that way, not just by the election authorities in each state, but even by Donald Trump's Department of Homeland Security. And now we ought to take seriously what is about to occur with these states trying to restrict voting rights. I marvel at my colleagues on the Republican side who come to the floor and say, we have no right. We have no right to tell these states what their laws should be when it comes to elections. This little booklet is in each of our desks. I would commend to my colleagues, particularly on the Republican side, to consider opening it and consider reading Article 1, Section 4. I'd like to read into the record of the United States Constitution. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. Then you go further in and read the Bill of Rights and the amendments to the Constitution. The Article 15, Amendment 15, says the right of citizens of the U.S. to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And yet Republican after Republican comes to the floor and questions how we could have the audacity to suggest that we're establishing standards so eligible voters across this country have an opportunity to vote. It is our constitutional responsibility to
The senior senator from South Carolina said soon after the riot that he was humiliated and embarrassed for our country and that Trump should, quote, count him out. But a few short weeks later, Trump counted him in for 2 days of golf and dining at Mar-a-Lago. And then there's the Republican leader. He said that the January 6th riots were, quote, fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth because he was angry he'd lost an election. He added that Trump was practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day, and he was right. Then the Republican leader and the majority of Republicans voted no on impeachment. They opposed a bipartisan commission to investigate the events of January 6th. They blocked 3 bills to protect our freedom to vote. And they endorsed a Senate candidate who agrees with Trump that the 2020 election was stolen from him. In total, 147 Republican members of the House and Senate, 147, voted to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And a number of those 8 Republican senators still won't admit that Joe Biden is our duly elected president. Why am I focusing on this? Because our country has reached a critical crossroads. Either we are going to come together as Americans, defend our democracy, and look back on January 6th as a painful low point in our nation's history, or we can turn our power to a mob that is willing to do anything and say anything to dismantle our democracy and destroy this
Would my
grand
colleague yield?
experience.
called
for a minute?
America. I would be happy to yield.
Okay, we're about to approach noon, where we'll have a moment of silence, not only in memory of those who were lost and those who were injured, but in all of the workforce here on Capitol Hill who worked through that day in a very, under dire circumstances. They did an amazing job, and in recognition of the great job they do for us every day. So we thank not only the floor staff, but all of those who work here. And with that, I think we'll commence the moment of silence, and after we finish, I'll call on Senator Klobuchar Durbin, and then Senator Stabenow will resume, okay? So if we might now at 12 noon, well, it's a little before 12.
Yeah.
It's 2 minutes before.
Senator Schumer.
Senator Klobuchar, is your
Thank you
2
very
minutes?
much. I just
Senator
want
from Minnesota.
I want to recognize the heroic efforts of our staff, many of whom are here with us today, of our law enforcement, who in the face of overwhelming numbers and an unprecedented violent assault valiantly placed their lives on the line for this republic. It is also an opportunity to remember to recommit ourselves to making sure nothing like this ever happens again. As President Biden said today, our democracy held, we the people endured, we the people prevailed. And we devote this moment of silence to those who stood up, not only for this building, not only for the people that worked here, but for our very democracy itself.
A minute of silence, a moment of silence for all of those who have helped us then and help us now, the staffs and everybody else.
Under the previous order, the Senate will now observe a moment of silence in observance of the events of January 6th, 2021.
Senator Stabenow.
The senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me just conclude by saying that either we are going to come together as Americans, which I hope and pray we do, to defend our democracy and look back on January 6th as a painful low point in our nation's history, or we can turn over power to a mob that is willing to do anything and say anything to dismantle our democracy and destroy this grand experiment called America. The January 6th insurrectionists tried to overthrow our Capitol, and their sidekicks in suits and ties are trying to overthrow our elections. And just as we shored up our security here to protect the people's house, we need to upgrade our election laws to protect people's freedom to vote. Today is a day to remember, to be grateful for all of those who risked and lost their lives to protect us, to be grateful for all of those who stood up for our democracy and continue to stand up every single day. Today is a day to be grateful that we live in this great democracy called America. And it's a day to recommit ourselves to protect our freedoms for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, this morning I've been listening to my colleagues, watching the news, watching our president reflecting on this day a year ago and where I was during this incredible insurrection that we now know happened on the Capitol. You know, I was in my Capitol office here, as we all have an office here in the Capitol, and I was getting ready to come to the floor of the Senate and certify that Joe Biden had won the presidency in a free and fair election. Senior Senator from Minnesota had organized many of us to stand in defense of that free and fair election, and I had been asked to stand in defense of the certified electoral votes in Arizona, and what I had been told they were going to challenge Nevada. It was a significant moment. Even before President Biden's victory, people had been spreading lies about the election for political gain, and I had planned to deliver a speech to combat those lies and explain in detail that the 2020 vote count was fair and accurate. And so, as I left my Capitol office and was walking to the Senate to deliver that speech, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. Because on my way out of my Capitol office, I came across two of my colleagues, one of them here today, Senator Smith and Senator Murkowski. And they were standing outside an open door to a restroom that we share amongst our Capitol offices. And I asked them what was going on. And they said, there's a Capitol Police officer in there. He's got something in his eyes, and he is flushing his eyes out with water. And I leaned in, and I saw the officer at the bathroom sink. And I thought to myself, and I said aloud to my colleagues, I think he's been pepper sprayed. And I asked him, has it been pepper sprayed? Have you been pepper sprayed? And he said, yes, but don't worry. Everything's fine. I am going to keep you all safe. And with that, he dashed back out the door, up the stairs, and outside to protect all of us and everyone else in this building. Now, I knew there had been a rally going on near the White House and that there were protests. What I did not know that morning was just how close the protesters were to forcing their way into this Capitol. Now, everyone knows what happened next. As we sat here, all of the senators, all of the staff that work with us day in and day out, our partners, the next thing we heard was this chamber being shut down by the Capitol Police, claiming that the Capitol had been breached. They told us to stay in our seats. This is the safest place where you can be right now, and we will protect you. And at that moment, we could all hear outside the doors. We didn't know what was going on because we can't see beyond this room what was happening outside, but we knew we could hear the voices and we could hear what was happening. And we also could hear outside of the one set of double doors that we call the hallway with the Ohio clock that leads to the rotunda, a lot of noise. And it was at that moment, as the noise was working its way towards the rotunda, that the Capitol Police officers then told all of us to get up and move quickly. And we moved out these opposite doors right here. Move as quickly as you possibly can. And that's when everybody came together. All of the senators, I don't care if we were Republican or Democrat, our floor staff that was with us, grabbing those electoral votes. And we all started going up and downstairs, through hallways, up and downstairs, through hallways, until we could get to a secure location. Now, as we were going through the hallways and when we got to this secure location, it was clear why this was happening. We were under attack because insurrectionists had been whipped into a frenzy by the false claim that the election in Nevada and in other states was fraudulent. That's exactly what the speaker said during that rally before the violence began. And we saw the same false claims in Nevada, where extremists tried to challenge our election results in an effort to prevent Joe Biden from becoming president. The former president's campaign and his supporters filed a total of 5 lawsuits challenging the security of the election system and targeting our state's Secretary of State in Nevada. Every one of those lawsuits was thrown out or failed, every single one of them in Nevada. And when the official tally was completed, President Biden won Nevada by 33,596 votes. The Nevada Secretary of State not only certified the election, she also investigated each and every claim of election fraud. And she made clear that her office found no evidence of widespread fraud. Now, I was the Attorney General of the state of Nevada for 8 years, and I can tell you from personal experience, when we find voter fraud, we prosecute it. And I also know there was, again, no widespread voter fraud in Nevada in the year 2020. And let me explain what widespread voter fraud means, because that is now being challenged by some of the former president's supporters. Widespread means that there was not enough to have changed the results of the election, that it was still a safe and secure election, and Joe Biden is our president. In fact, not only Nevada's elections were safe, accessible, and secure, but across the country they have been proven to be safe, accessible, and secure. I also want to share with the rest of the country that my state, in Nevada, we have enacted important protections for protecting voting rights, including automatic voter registration, vote by mail, early voting, and same-day registration. In the 2020 presidential elections, almost half of Nevadans, people from both parties, took advantage of our vote by mail laws. But because the defeated former president and his supporters were upset that he lost the election, some of them publicized the lie that he had won. And that lie, in turn, spurred members of the public to violence that resulted in 5 deaths and countless injuries. Now, we all know after the Capitol Police helped us move to safety, my colleagues and I from both parties talked about what to do. We knew the insurrectionists were trying to stop us from certifying the election, and we knew that we had to finish our jobs, no matter how late it was. And we all agreed that we had to go back to the Senate chamber so that we could show the rest of the country that we would not let our democracy be subverted by violence, that we would honor our Constitution and the peaceful transfer of power in this country. And I want to make this clear. I would have stood up to certify the valid results of the 2020 election, no matter who won. This isn't about partisanship. It's about patriotism. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution and protect it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And nothing and no one will prevent me from doing that sworn duty. So I walked back to the Senate floor on the evening of January 6th to finish my work. I'll remember what I saw the rest of my life. As I walked back, furniture had been thrown everywhere like matchsticks. Trash, broken glass littered the floor. It was like a war zone. That night, I stood up and spoke in defense of our democracy, as I'd planned to do hours before. And at 3:42 a.m., Vice President Pence announced that Joe Biden was the president-elect. We honored the democratic transfer of power for the 59th time in American history. But I'm here to tell you there is so much to do to ensure that there will be a 60th time. Our democracy is more fragile than it has been in decades. The same bad actors who fueled the violence in the first place, including the defeated former president and his supporters, continue to spread the big lie that the election was stolen. And they are using these false claims to pass legislation threatening our very democracy. Around the country, more than 400 state laws were introduced to restrict voting last year alone. In Nevada, we expanded vote-by-mail drop box locations, but in Florida, Georgia, Iowa, and Indiana, new laws make it harder to use those drop boxes. Nevada has same-day voter registration, but Texas just made it harder to register, not easier. And in Georgia, it's now even illegal to give food or water to people waiting in long lines to vote. And the list goes on and on. These are partisan laws. They're designed to favor one group of voters over another. That's not democracy. A real democracy honors everyone's right to be heard. It makes sure that everyone gets a vote and that every vote is counted. Democracy is a remarkable thing, a system where the people get to choose their own leaders. And we all need to stand up for it, just as the countless heroes of our history have done, from Elizabeth Cady Stanton to Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King Jr. So, I will not stop fighting to protect our country and our democracy. I will continue working with my colleagues to pass voting rights legislation. We need to follow Nevada's lead and protect access to the polls. And we cannot let anyone silence America's voice in their own government. Now, Mr. President, I also want to recognize many of the heroes who protected us that day, like that Capitol Police officer that I encountered that morning. After the attack was over, I learned that 140 of the police officers I passed in the halls of Congress every day had broken bones or worse. 4 of them later took their own lives. These are brave men and women who put themselves at risk every day to protect not just the people's elected representatives, but our dedicated staff and the hard-working people here at the Capitol, from the janitors to cafeteria workers to postal employees. All of these people carry their own memories of January 6th, and we need to make sure they never have to go through something like that again. So many of them are still here at the Capitol, still doing their jobs, like that Capitol Police officer who I saw earlier who had been pepper sprayed. But I'll tell you what, they give me hope. And they remind me that all of us have a job to do, just like we did on January 6th. 1 year later, it's clear that we all must stand united in defense of our democracy. And Mr. President, I hope we can do just that. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, a year ago, thousands of supporters of then-President Donald Trump, marching under banners supporting secession, conspiracy theories, and white supremacy, violently stormed the United States Capitol and breached the Senate and House chambers in hopes of overturning a free and fair election in which 7 million more Americans voted for President Biden. There was, of course, no proof and no truth to the claims of aberrant voting that Mr. Trump invented in order to fuel the mob. The assault on the Capitol was an attack on the United States and on democracy itself. We have the brave men and women of the U.S. Capitol Police to thank for defending the country against what can accurately be called an insurrection. And while the assault failed that day, thanks to the efforts of these officers and their partners from neighboring jurisdictions, an insidious campaign against our democracy continues through the baseless lies and antics of the former president and his associates. Mr. Trump set the events of January 6th in motion when he refused to say that he would accept the results of the November 2020 election. And he continued to value his ego over our democracy when he urged the mob to march on the Capitol and disrupt the election certification process. He repeatedly lied that the election he lost by 7 million votes had somehow been stolen, when the facts and the courts demonstrated that was clearly not the case. Stoked by this vitriol, Mr. Trump's supporters used pipes and flagpoles to brutally beat police officers. Some of the attacks were also directed at or planned to be directed at our own members in both the House and the Senate. And anyone who refused to subvert the election was a target of the insurrectionist mob, and that included Mr. Trump's own Vice President Mike Pence. And Mr. Trump, who lit the fuse and stood by, his actions sent a demoralizing signal to billions around the world as they watched his supporters assault the Capitol. 1 year ago today, the U.S. Capitol Police, federal, state, and local law enforcement partners and the National Guard physically cleared and secured the Capitol buildings and grounds. The House of Representatives impeached Mr. Trump for his actions, yet most of the Senate Republican colleagues made tortured arguments that his actions were reprehensible but not technically impeachable. As a result, the democratically defeated former president continues his rhetorical assaults through lies and misinformation. He would rather rip our country apart and undermine our elections and democracy rather than accept the will of the American voters. The bipartisan House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol is working tirelessly to get to the truth of that day. It is methodically collecting and following the evidence despite a lack of cooperation from Mr. Trump and his inner circle. The committee must continue to be transparent, and we must all continue to call out the repeated lies of Trump and his enablers. Every American, regardless of party affiliation, who believes in the right to vote and upholding the Constitution should want the truth about January 6th to come out. Congress must rise to the occasion. The stakes could not be any higher. Because of the former president's actions a year ago and his relentless lying since then, a significant minority of Americans now indicate that violence is an acceptable way to resolve political disagreement. We cannot afford to have such a sentiment persist. Together, we must accept the truth, restore trust in one another, and take steps to improve political discourse. One step we must take is to honor the officers of the Capitol Police, not just with our words, but with real support. Last year, we passed a supplemental appropriations bill that provided over $107 million in additional funding, including roughly $35 million for overtime, retention bonuses, hazard pay, and student loan repayments for officers. It also provided critical funding to address the trauma experienced by our officers and help support their mental health needs. But we can't stop there. We have to continue in this fiscal year's budget, 2022, to continue to support our police, continue to support those who protect us. I'm afraid if we don't quickly resolve our differences that we could fall into the state of a continuing resolution, which would actually deny our police, the Capitol Police, and our security forces the tools they need not only to protect us and protect themselves, but also to sustain their morale, sustain their mental health,